Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. On June the 5th, we will mark the anniversary of the 30 years since the first diagnosis of the first AIDS case was made. For that, to mark that anniversary, here are a few figures. More than 33 million people live today with HIV in the world. In 2009, more than 7,000 new infections were recorded each day, of which 97% were found in countries with low revenues and poor means for dealing with the epidemic. And since the beginning of it, nearly 30 million people have died for causes linked to the HIV virus. And yet, 30 years since that first diagnosis of the AIDS virus, no vaccination has been found against the illness, which doesn't mean that, of course, huge progress has not been made, including the discovery in 1983 of the HIV virus, which is, of course, at the origin of AIDS. Today, on the France 24 interview, I have the pleasure of speaking with Françoise Barré-Sinoussi, who was the co-recipient of the Nobel Prize for Medicine back in 2008, my apologies, specifically for that discovery. Thanks very much indeed for being with us. Going back for a moment to 1983, when you contributed to that crucial discovery of the HIV virus, this was a time, it's almost difficult to cast one's mind back, but there were 50 recorded cases in France, no more than 250 in the United States. The epidemic was at its very beginning, and no one could have imagined the scale on which it would take place.
No, exactly. At that time, we did not imagine what will be the epidemic. Indeed, you know, the reported cases were first in some group of population, hemophiliacs. The first even reported on June 1981. Were on homosexual. And it started, you know, I remember that at that time, we were not even speaking about AIDS. We were speaking about the 4H disease.
The 4H, which referred to?
Which referred to homosexual, hemophiliacs, heroinoman, and Haitian.
So four very specific categories.
Four specific categories of population. And unfortunately, we forgot one category, heterosexual.
Which was to follow.
Which was
no doubt already beginning.
Yeah.
Simply we hadn't realized that it was to be an illness that would take the world by storm. And of course, those beginnings no doubt led to the stigmatization that was to follow, and that even today continues to do so much harm.
Exactly. I mean, that was certainly the beginning of the discrimination and stigmatization of a certain population that are still today very much stigmatized, particularly in some countries, in Africa or in Eastern Europe, for example, with violence on this population, which is really not acceptable. I mean, it was not already acceptable 30 years ago, but today it's certainly not acceptable.
And stigmatization, of course, that is less violent, no doubt, in Western Europe, but that is nonetheless real. Are you surprised, 30 years since that extraordinary discovery for which you won the Nobel Prize, are you surprised that there is still no vaccination against AIDS?
Today I'm not surprised. Although in the early 80s, if you had asked me that question, I would have said, oh, now that we have the virus, it will be very easy to develop a vaccine, it will be very easy to develop a treatment, and so on. Treatment, the scientists have been able to develop a treatment for life, but a treatment for vaccine. We did not imagine at all in the early 80s the complexity of this virus, the complexity of the interaction of this virus with the different players of our immune defense. So it's all over the year that through research and science we started to understand the complexity.
The discovery of such a vaccine is the holy grail in the sense of for researchers like yourself, and would be presumably lots of money is ploughed into it. Many years of research have gone into it. Are you confident that one day we will find it?
I'm confident that we shall at least, let's say, get a vaccine that will protect against the development, the progression of AIDS. However, we are still hopeful because it has been this vaccine trial done a few years ago, and we got the data of the Thailand vaccine trial showing that at least a small proportion of the vaccinees, 30% of them, were protected. That was the first time, after so many years of vaccine research, that a very small group of people were protected. So we are starting, of course, 30% is not enough for vaccine. We need at least 50% protection.
But these are small steps.
But this is a step
Forward
to try to understand better the mechanism of protection in those people and also to improve the vaccine candidates.
Now, of course, as a researcher, presumably that remains the aim. But of course, so much has been achieved, partly because of discoveries like your own. People no longer face death when they have their HIV status announced to them. Now they have a life of living with a combination of different drugs that will ensure that they have a relatively normal life. And that is the huge transformation, really, of the last 30 years. That is the huge advance.
This is really, 1996 were really a turn. Let's say we are not used to speak anymore about people living with AIDS. We are speaking about people living with HIV. So that makes really the difference.
Now, of course, one of the big problems remains the disparity worldwide in access to the sorts of medicines that allow people to live normal lives.
Exactly. The problem is to have access to infected and affected individuals in Africa or in low income countries. Certainly, this is a terrible difficulty. So we have to increase testing, voluntary testing, everywhere in the world, even in our countries, to tell you the truth, because particularly in those countries I'm used to work with Cameroon, but also with Cambodia and Vietnam, and you can see in the hospital that people are still arriving at the hospital at the stage where they have tuberculosis, do not have any immune defense. So even if you treat them today, the benefit of the treatment is not as great as if those people were tested before HIV positive and immediately treated. So even if you have a political willingness, like a country in Cambodia, I mean, I give it as an example because the decision maker, the politician over there, decided to enroll all patients that need to be treated on treatment. And they have been quite successful because of the international support. However, even today, if they say, okay, we are going to treat all, the problem is that they cannot have access to all.
And that remains the difficulty.
That remains really a difficulty.
Finally, and very briefly, we were speaking about this earlier. One of the big effects of AIDS on research, on science generally, has been almost the humanization, in a sense, of the scientific process. Is that something that you think that the discovery of AIDS, of HIV, of all that's happened in the last few years has brought to science, and from which we can no longer retreat?
That's true. Even for scientists as myself, I was used to work in my laboratories with very little contact, even with hospital, with health professional, and of course, no contact at all with the patients. And with this disease, very early on, indeed, it's really the clinician that came to us at Pasteur and said, look, there is the emergence of this disease. We have the few cases in France. Do you think this virus, this family of virus, can be responsible for it? So it was the start of a long-term collaboration between clinicians and scientists. And very soon after, when we decided of the first sample to try to identify the virus, we said, okay, but we have to ask the patient whether he would accept to participate to the research. And this was the other step, to work with the patients themselves and the representative of patients. And I must say that today, we are very much used each time that we are proposing a research project or research program. This is discussed, of course, with clinicians, but also with representative of patients. And for me, that has been very fruitful because certainly I have changed my way of thinking in science to try to think if I was a patient, what I would expect from the scientist. So this is a different way of thinking. And also, patient, representative of patient have been very active to try to convince the politician to invest for access to treatment. They have been also very much involved in making pressure on the pharma for decreasing the price of the drug. But alone, the scientist and the clinician will not have been able to do that. It's really this collaboration between scientist, health professional, and representative of patients that has been very successful. Not enough. We have to continue the fight, but this is certainly an example that is starting to be repeated in other areas than HIV/AIDS.
Françoise Barré-Sinoussi, thanks very much indeed for having been our guest today. That's the end of this interview. We'll be back, though, very soon for another here on France 24. Do stay with us.